So before leaving the floor to the moderator, just a quick 5 minutes to introduce EXAPT. So EXAPT is the cross-border conflict evidence policy and trends research program, which examines transnational conflict dynamics and the drivers of violent and peaceful behavior to inform more effective international policy responses. We are funded by UK International Development from the UK government to the Research and Evidence Directorate of FCDO. Next slide, please. So as you can see, we work with a diverse range of geographies from West Africa all the way across the Horn through the Middle East and Asia. And we work with different partners. So right now we're based at Chemonics UK and we're working in King College London, but in the history of the program, we've also worked with different partners, including Chatham House, the House Foundation, and Carnegie Middle East. Next slide, please. So EXAPT is generally very interdisciplinary, but we have a specific climate and conflict research stream. And this event is part of that research stream. So the climate and conflict research portfolio basically investigates how climate pressures and policy responses to them shape patterns of conflict and resilience. Particularly across two main thematics. The first one is climate change, informal trade, and instability. So there we're trying to study how climate pressures intersect with informal economy and governance gaps to shape patterns of instability and resilience. And then the second theme is climate mitigation and conflict dynamics. So we're examining how global climate mitigation efforts, climate mineral extraction, green transition, and land use shifts shape local conflict drivers and political economies. So this event kind of sits at the intersection of these two thematics. So without further ado, I will leave the floor to Tobias Ide, which is EXAPT Climate and Conflict Research Fellows, to introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Benedetta, for the kind introduction to the panel and to myself, and a very warm welcome from my side. The event we're having today is a very timely and important one. The topic itself is not completely new, of course. Already in the aftermath of World War II, we saw discussions around the environmental impacts of war, and we saw international negotiations and eventually also treaties to forbid certain elements of warfare that might have adverse impacts on the environment, including weather manipulation, for instance. The topic was evaluated to further prominence in the 2000s when groundbreaking research by the United Nations Environmental Program and some scholars associated with them or working towards them found out that post-conflict societies actually suffered from immense levels of environmental destruction, mostly due to two dynamics. The first dynamics is that fighting itself causes destruction and environmental harm. Think of ammunition staying in the ground, leaking certain minerals into the groundwater or into the soil, or think of the destruction of dams, of chemical facilities, of power plants, and so on. And on top of that, and that's the second dynamic, we see the indirect impacts of war, because states and NGOs can no longer enforce and monitor environmental policies and environmental qualities in some areas. Think of local communities that do not know whether the forest they preserved for years and years is still available next year, or whether it will be burned down due to fighting, or they will be displaced due to the conflict. So they might use all the wood they have for heating this winter, or for the construction of a refugee camp. And in the most recent years, quite unfortunately, the topic gained immense prominence with significant adverse environmental impacts from wars in Ukraine, Gaza, and more recently Iran, to name just a few. As unfortunate as these dynamics and trends are, I am very happy to welcome today 5 leading experts that help us to shed more light on the environmental impacts of war, how war impacts nature, but also what can be done about it and how to reduce the impacts of war. And I'm going to introduce all our five panelists very quickly before we jump into the substantial discussion. So first we have with us online Natalia Skripnikova from Grid Arendal in Norway. She's a researcher with a long track record of working on environmental governance, and she was recently involved in an ICCEP-funded research on the environmental dimensions of conflict in the Lake Chad region. Also online, we have Doug Weir, who's the director of the Environment and Conflict and Environment Observatory here in the UK, which does groundbreaking work on the environmental impacts of war. And Doug himself has many years of experience in research on advocacy on the environment and conflict and on UN processes on his side. Then directly next to me, we have Sarah Nyeri, who's a peace and conflict scholar based on the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, specializing in humanitarianism, development, and environmental peace building. And she has done extensive work on post-conflict reconstruction and mine action, among others, that she will bring to the panel. Then we have on my very left, on your very right, Elisa Savelli, a practitioner and policy specialist from Mercy Corps, focusing on conflict, environmental degradation, and conflict risks. And she is currently one of the principal investigators of another ICCEP-funded research project on fragile borderlands, drought adaptation, and instability in the MENA region. And last, but certainly not least, in the middle, we have Will Reynolds. He's the conflict and climate lead at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO, here in the UK, and brings strong expertise in conflict-sensitive programming, climate security, and policy analysis. Now, so much for housekeeping and introductions. Now let's jump right into the panel. Just to give you a quick idea about the order, I will start the panel with one opening question to each of the 5 panelists. After we heard all 5 answers, we will open up the discussion for questions, comments, and general elaboration, both from those in the room, online, and obviously also from those on the panel. Feel free to ask questions as well. And we should hopefully have at least half an hour for that part to keep it interactive and to hear your thoughts as well. Now we start with Natalia and jump right into the Lake Chad region in Western Africa, which is conceived by many experts as a climate change and security hotspots. And Natalia, you recently published a report on the region. How does armed conflict impact the state of environment in the Lake Chad region?
Hello, I hope you can hear me now. Give me a sign, please.
Very well.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. There is a slight technical difficulty. I will not see you because I'm sharing my screen, but I can hear you. So first of all, thank you so much for having me today at this event. And thank you so much for the introduction, Tobias. And to answer the question that you, Tobias, posted to me, I would like to give a short presentation about the report, focusing on main takeaways. As you mentioned, I have been involved in the project Climate, Peace and Security Lake Chad. And as one of the outcomes of this project, we completed a report which is called Environmental Dimensions of Conflict in the Lake Chad Region. And you can access it online. And in this report, we focused our research on two aspects, such as how instability and insecurity impact the natural environment in the region, and how the environment with its natural variability and anthropogenically driven changes impacts conflict and insecurity. In this regard, the regional context was considered as an important factor. The Lake Chad is a transboundary water body which intersects the borders of Chad, Cameroon, Niger, and Nigeria. As many of you probably know, in the second half of the 20th century, the lake has declined significantly in size, serving for 40 million people in the region. The region is affected by a combination of climate change, population growth, poor management of natural resources, and security risks. And I would like to focus for a moment on the major security risks that could be summarized as ethno-religious grievances, intercommunal clashes, conflicts between farmers and pastoralists, and insurgent-led violence by extremist groups such as Boko Haram and its offshoot, the Islamic State in the West Africa province, which operates throughout the region. In response to conflict in the Lake Chad region, the countries affected by the instability and several regional and international partners, with the support of the African Union, developed a regional strategy for the stabilization, resilience, and recovery. The strategy was in effect from 2019 to 2024, and during 2025, the strategy was evaluated and updated. A new version will be implemented from 2026 to 2030. Our research was focused on the immediate area of the Lake Chad before 1960s, when the lake underwent a rapid decline in size, as well as the environment of a broader region and administrative areas around the lake. And that was done due to several reasons. Firstly, the conflict spreads across a wider region. And secondly, while administrative boundaries do not align with ecosystem or socio-ecological system boundaries in the region, they do shape governance, environmental management, and information gathering. In order to assess how instability and insecurity impact the natural environment in the region, as well as how the environment interplays with conflict and insecurity, we established the environmental baseline. Then we considered short and long-term environmental impacts of combat operations and of human displacement in response to conflict. And finally, we complemented the environmental impact assessment with a more systemic approach using conflict, environment, human nexus as an overarching framing. What did we learn from environmental baseline? First of all, ecosystems and human populations in the Sahel face increasing climate instability, with increased risks of extreme weather events, including extreme seasonal rainfall and less overall predictability of seasonal weather patterns. Secondly, the lake is now less than a tenth of its extent in 1960s. But the remaining southern pool, which is a fraction of a lake size in 1960s, is showing a trend of expanding and challenging the narrative or disappearance trend. But anyways, it is just a fraction of a bigger lake. And thirdly, Lake Chad is the biggest body of water in the Sahel, which means that it supports livelihoods and regulates water supply for millions of people in the region. What do we know about the environmental impacts of violence and combat operations in the Lake Chad region? From field reports and interviews, we know that the conflict in this region is characterized by a pattern of temporally and geographically scattered localized violent accidents by insurgent groups against local populations, between insurgent groups and between insurgents and counterterrorism forces. Our assessment shows that remote areas with natural vegetation cover and potentially high conservation value may be particularly at risk from direct impacts of insurgency and combat operations. Violent incidents cause direct impacts on the local environment where they occur. The expert interviews also highlighted environmental impacts associated with the construction of garrison towns, heavily fortified areas serving as an operational base for Nigerian counter-insurgent troops, as well as safe harbor for internally displaced people fleeing violence. It's important to point out that there is limited information on quantities and types of ammunition used in violent incidents in the Lake Chad region. However, the interviews highlight the widespread use of improvised explosive devices, which, apart from the human cost, cause physical damage to the environment and the threat to wildlife. An important part of understanding the environmental dimension of the conflict is the understanding of the natural resource economy in the region and the ways in which it is interwoven with insecurity and conflict. The expert interviews emphasized the importance of the natural resource economy as a source of finance for insurgent groups, often in connection with organized crime. The wealth of natural resources and wildlife products is exploited directly or indirectly by armed insurgent groups to generate income, including through extortion and taxation of local. What emerged from the research is a picture in which the activities of armed groups in the Sahel are closely linked to cultural traditions, organized crime, and the broad natural resource-based economy on which many people in the region depend. It is challenging to obtain an estimate of how much money insurgent groups extract from the natural resource economy through extortion and taxation, but there were some estimates circulating in the literature at the same time. Taken together, our findings point to a broader picture. And in conclusion, I would like to highlight an emergent socio-ecological system perspective that we observed throughout the research, which we refer to as conflict environment-human nexus. Sorry. Our research on environmental factors found human traditions and institutions are closely adapted to the environment. And we also identified that natural resource economy as another integral element interwoven with conflict and insecurity in the Lake Chad Basin. Our analysis also showed that understanding the environmental dimension of conflict requires a systems perspective. By adopting a systems perspective, we can better understand the interconnected and dynamic factors that shape conflict and stability in the region. And I will stop here, and I am looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Natalia. We are moving on to DAC. The Conflict and Environment Observatory conducts crucial monitoring work on the environmental impacts of war, including on current cases like Ukraine, Gaza, or Iran. Can you tell us more about this work and some of its key findings?
Sure. Thanks, Darius. Good afternoon, everybody. Many thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about harm and about damage and about how we kind of conceptualize it and think about it. As Tobias mentioned, quite a lot of our work is spent monitoring the environmental dimensions of armed conflicts and military activities. This photo is from Tehran in March after Israel bombed 4 oil facilities in the city, resulting in millions of people potentially exposed to harmful pollutants and causing black rain and, quite unusually, headlines around the world that the environment doesn't usually get this degree of attention. Okay, so when we think about harm, so the environmental consequences of any war are obviously dependent on how and where it's fought, and by whom and for how long. Harms can be ephemeral or long-lasting. They can be spatially limited, widespread, or made mobile through components of the environment, such as air or water, or even through their biota, including through people. more often than not, they're complex, context-specific, and uncertain. And because of the physical and security constraints created by armed conflicts, they frequently go undocumented or remain poorly understood. As researchers, we define the environmental impacts of war as direct or indirect, although this distinction can blur at times. I think we're probably most familiar with the direct impacts: oil spills, the bomb turbation and pollution of heavily shelled soils, wildfires on front lines, or the millions of tons of contaminated debris generated by explosive weapons in towns and cities. So these direct impacts from blasts, from fires, pollution, and mechanical action are a result of the choices made by military actors. And on occasion, of course, the environment can also be directly targeted or weaponized by belligerents. So while the direct damage gets more attention, in some cases the indirect environmental consequences of conflicts can be more serious and pernicious and widespread. Many of these are linked to socioeconomic and demographic changes in conflict areas, or to the loss of access to resources, which can lead to unsustainable coping strategies, like wood for fuel and shelter driving deforestation. We see prolonged insecurity in ungoverned spaces, and these are a characteristic of both conflict areas and many transitions to peace, and these can facilitate the unsustainable use of natural resources. Conflicts can also undermine environmental governance, potentially affecting the environment nationwide and for years after hostilities. The environmental consequences of conflicts can be transboundary. They can also be telecoupled, for example, linking increased global commodity prices to land conversion for agricultural expansion on the other side of the world. And conflicts can obviously also undermine global environmental governance, disrupting the consensus-based work of multilateral environmental agreements on existential threats. So wartime environmental damage impacts people as well as ecosystems. Most obvious is probably conflict pollution. Many of the longer term consequences of this kind of form of slow violence often go undocumented. Livelihoods and health can both be impacted by damage to natural resources or disruption to their management systems. Meanwhile, resource and ecosystem degradation and the loss of livelihoods increase community exposure to environmental shocks. If we zoom out,
if I can briefly interrupt you, we cannot see your slides, neither can the people online.
Perfect. You've not seen them at all? That's amazing. Just one moment.
But we can see you very clearly.
You didn't want slides anyway, right?
Yeah.
I've just shared again. Can you see them now?
Now it's
Amazing.
perfect.
Brilliant. I'll start again. No, I won't start again. Okay. I'd like to have a picture with your words. Where was I? Yes. So if we zoom out, we can think from the individual or community level to humanity as a whole by considering how conflicts and militarism impact global commons like the atmosphere and also undermine international environmental governance and cooperation. Finally, the psychological impact of conflict-linked environmental loss remains under studies, but it's suggested to be profound for both individuals and communities. Okay, glad we got the nice pictures at this stage. So, two examples from Ukraine kind of challenge our efforts to categorize conflict-linked harm. The destruction of the Kakhovka Dam and reservoir devastated downstream communities. It put a nuclear plant's cooling water at risk, stripped a huge area of arid southern Ukraine of water security, and exposed thousands of tons of industrial pollutants in its lakebed. The indirect, or perhaps more accurately, reverberating environmental consequences of the direct attack on the dam have been widespread, lasting, and hugely complex. So another persistent challenge is that of uncertainty, and in this case caused by technological development. We've never seen mass drone warfare before and only poorly understand its environmental consequences. Tens of thousands of drones trailing tens of kilometers of fiber optic cables each are being used by Russia and Ukraine every month. Millions of kilometers of cable now blanket frontline areas. The plastics may take up to 700 years to degrade, snaring wildlife, obstructing resource use, and releasing pollutants like PFAS. While many forms of conflict-linked environmental harm are predictable, we always see new means through which the environment is damaged. Okay, so turning a little bit to data now. Our ability to understand conflict-linked environmental harm is often impeded by data gaps. So we recently launched the methodology we've developed for remote environmental assessment, something which is made vital due to the access and local capacity constraints common to conflicts. Our Wartime Incidents to Environment Database, or WISEN as we call it, currently focuses on environmental harm linked to damage or disruption to environmentally sensitive facilities. It's a way of ordering and utilizing data from sources such as conflict datasets, satellites, and open source intelligence for initial risk screening that can inform assessment on the ground. It's also designed to gather data that can be used for advocacy, to challenge the systemic under-prioritization of the environment with respect to conflicts, and of course, evidence for accountability processes. So we've tested WISEN on Ukraine, Sudan, and on Iran and the wider region, with improvements in each iteration. For example, we're about to launch a way for the public to help on the Zooniverse online citizen science platform. But it's just one part of what we see as this wider goal of a conflict environmental data commons. If we're genuinely interested in understanding and addressing the environmental dimensions of armed conflicts, we need deeper collaboration and coordination between researchers, supported by sustained funding. Improved access to satellite and open source data have radically improved and helped democratize conflict environmental assessments. And this is increasing visibility and awareness, one of the reasons we're probably having this event. That visibility is rightly setting public expectations around assistance and accountability, both at home and in conflict areas. But it's also increasing expectations around environmentally sustainable post-war recovery in the face of a triple planetary crisis. So these expectations must be built on a foundation of data, which is itself dependent on our first building, a robust conflict and environmental data commons. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Moving on to Sarah here, right next to me. Sarah, unexploded bombs and landmines are a key challenge in many post-conflict regions. How do they affect land management, and what does this mean for ordinary citizens?
I need that. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel, and to be part of quite an esteemed colleagues and researchers who are doing this. I followed the instructions to the T. I didn't prepare slides, so I'll read my notes. Sorry if you get bored of the draws. I apologize for that. So unexploded bombs or unexploded ordnance are bombs that failed to detonate. These include landmines, cluster munitions, and they remain in the soil of many countries long after the fighting ends. So if you think about Ukraine, Cambodia, Somaliland, which is the country that I've researched a lot, Iraq, Angola, and Sri Lanka, these are not just places that are of past conflict, but ongoing everyday danger. I argue that in this presentation that unexploded ordnances is not only a humanitarian problem, and this is the way sometimes it is perceived, but an environmental, a developmental, and land management problem that reshapes how people use, access, and care for land, and therefore how they survive after war. It is not only a global South problem, it is also visible in Europe, where wildfires are now exposing buried ordnances in places like the North Yorkshire Moors, very close to where I came from this morning, Slovenia, and Ukraine. So first, then to answer how this relates to land management, is first, unexploded ordnances fundamentally disrupts land management. In areas where there is contamination, land is often treated as blocked or denied. So farmers cannot access this land, they cannot plow, they cannot graze their animals or collect firewood. Also, the production of agricultural production is reduced when in places, for example, in Ukraine, between the wheat production fell by 41% between 2001 and 2024. In part because of the contamination of the ordnances. But the problem is not just new conflicts. In Cambodia, decades after intense US bombing during the Vietnam War, unexploded bombs still lie in fertile land. Many farmers avoid using tractors, so Cambodia has moved from immediate post-conflict to looking towards development, and as farmers then begin to use mechanical farming methods, the mechanical the tractors are used. Sorry. They avoid using tractors and machinery because of the fear of setting off horns. This means they cannot adopt more productive techniques, and land remains underused and degraded. So unexploded ordinances changes land management in three key ways. Yeah, I'll get there in the end. It restricts access. People avoid certain fields, pathways, water sources, or forests. Then that means that the changes in practice, farmers will adopt low risk and low productivity methods. No tractors, no deep tiling, and no construction. It concentrates also pressure. So if some land is feared to be contaminated, then people will automatically cluster in land that is safe. That results to overgrazing, overcultivation that leads to then degradation of the areas more quickly. So as Doug has alluded, there is a direct and also indirect environmental impact from UXOs or unexploded ordinances. And directly, the explosions will create craters, they remove vegetation and compact soil. More insidiously, unexploded bombs and landmines can leach heavy metals and toxic chemicals. And studies found, for example, in some areas in Iraq, have found that following demining activities, these hazardous metals are found in the soil, and this has risks to ecosystem, human health through contact through contact, dust, and contaminated food chains. A recent study by colleagues from the University of Queensland and UNDP on the Solomon Islands, for example, found links between World War II bomb contamination and toxic chemicals leaking into soil, water, and the coastal ecosystem as the metal casings corrode. This has impact, of course, on public health for communities living and feeding off that ecosystem. Indirectly, the methods used to clear the ordinances, so the responses to this contamination also can cost and degrade land. So most of the heavy machines that are used for demining can compact soil, they do have to remove vegetation, and that increases erosion. Controlled detonations can also release pollutants in the air and the soil. In some cases, clearance operations themselves become a source of land degradation, even as they make land safe for people. There is a lot of concern from the sector that responds to contamination, and they're looking into ways in which they can mitigate this impact from their work. My research with Dr. Christina Green connects more broadly these concepts in our paper on land degradation. We argue that explosive remnants of war or unexploded ordinances and climate change act as dual stressors on land. So climate hazards, droughts, floods, heavy heat waves can dislodge and bury landmines and ordinances, moving them into previously safe areas. At the same time, ordnance contaminated land or degraded land more generally is less able to absorb climate shocks. So degraded soils hold less water, they support less vegetation and store less carbon. So unexploded ordinances is not just a static hazard. It interacts very dynamically with climate change and land management practices. And this is not a hypothetical risk or a hypothetical risk. In Europe, it's already happening. As I've mentioned, the North Yorkshire Moors, a major wildfire last year over the summer in 2025, burned across large areas of moorland and triggered repeated explosions from buried historic munitions. When rights of ways were reopened, I hike a lot. I live in Yorkshire. I hike a lot, and this came into my radar that there was a renewed warning to walkers that unexploded ordnances remained a risk. In other words, fire did not just damage that landscape, it revealed hidden military debris and complicated restoration, access, and public safety. The same pattern has appeared elsewhere, as I said, in Europe, where wildfires for example, in Slovenia, in the Kras region, set off First World War ordnances, forcing firefighters to work cautiously around the edges to address the blaze. So what does this mean to ordinary citizens? At the most immediate level, it means everyday risk. In Ukraine, and we use a lot of examples from Ukraine because it's the most contaminated at present. Landmines and exploded ordnances have cost more than 1,000 civilians since 2022. Probably the number is much, much higher. So unexploded ordnances shapes the mundane realities of daily life. You know, whether it's mothers letting children out to play or farmers expanding their livelihoods. So for farmers, contamination means lower yields, higher labor costs, and reduced income. In Cambodia, as I said, farmers avoid using tractors on land that might contain unexploded bombs. In terms of land management, ordinary citizens face a dilemma. Use the land and risk death or injury, or avoid it and risk poverty and food insecurity. This is what we call double exposure. So people are exposed simultaneously to climate stressors and to the legacies of war. And I think that has been alluded to by the two previous speakers. And people are exposed simultaneously to climate stressors and to the legacies of war. And these stressors reinforce each other. In European settings, the consequences might look different, but they're still serious. Disrupted access to countryside, delayed restoration, threats to firefighters and public fear around the land that was thought safe. But for indigenous communities and rural communities who often depend closely on land and water and forests, the impact is disproportionate. Contaminated land may mean loss of cultural practices tied to specific places, loss of traditional knowledge, and forced migration. In my own study in Somaliland, for example, there's some demined land that communities felt they did not want to interact with. And I think with communities that put a lot of cultural value on land, this may have quite overreaching consequences. So policy and practice and the integration and why that matters. So what should be done? First, we need to stop treating explosive ordnance and land degradation and climate change as separate problems. In practice, the responses to these ordinances, climate adaptation and land restoration are planned and funded separately. Even when we're talking with policy stakeholders, issues are thought of separately. But for ordinary citizens, these are one and the same, and they want land safe. So we need climate resilient, for example, responses to clearance methods, integrated land use planning, where demining, farming, and water management and reforestation are dealt with together closely. Community-led approaches, local people know which areas feel unsafe, how they use the land and the practices, and what practices are feasible. Their knowledge, therefore, should guide clearance priorities and land rehabilitation. And we need to recognize that these ordinances is not just a post-conflict issue. It is also a climate issue, a food security issue, and a peace building issue. The presence of unexploded ordnances can hinder responses to climate events, as we've had in eastern Ukraine. Landmine contamination hampers forest fires. In Libya, for example, the flooding and the flooding of munitions, the flooding that caused munition to be transferred to new areas. So in conclusion, unexploded ordinances reshapes land management by restricting access, altering practices, and degrading soils and ecosystems. For ordinary citizens, this means living with constant risk, reduced livelihoods, and limited options for recovery. Addressing this requires integrated approaches that links mine action, climate adaptation, and land restoration, and centering the everyday realities of the people who live on this land. Only then can we move from a logic of denial and risk to one of safe, productive, and resilient land for all. War doesn't just end when the fighting stops. It remains in the soil, and climate change is helping to bring it back to the surface. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. And I think you brought up an important point that we use to transition to the next presentation, namely that war does not just have direct and indirect negative impacts on the environment, but that war also impacts the ability of communities to deal with other forms of environmental stress that might not necessarily be war related. And I think that's where Elissa comes in. We know that war and violence complicate adaptation to climate change. And you did a lot of work on the Middle East. How does armed conflict increase the vulnerability to climate change from your experience?
Thank you. And thanks for inviting me to this very timely and important event. I'm going to share my perspective on the world of nature, which is grounded in years of work across the Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon and the wider region, but also based on my critical scientific understanding of the social environmental system we live in. Next, please. I would say that when I hear a war on nature, I think that the war on nature starts where we start separating humanity from nature by making land, water, ecosystem, and even some lives cheap, disposable, extractable. And I'm using the word of Jason Moore that in his The Rise of Cheap Nature article argues that the separation of the uppercase nature from the uppercase humanity is the first violence exerted on nature and some human being. And this violence is manifested in the socioeconomic and political systems that makes water extractable, that enclose and destroy lands, and that enables accumulation of resources for the few. And if we see in the next slide how this environmental violence is manifested at the global scale, I can use a recent publication by Mark Antonio and Field, where they ask themselves, why does a wealthy and peaceful country have also the lowest level of sustainability, of environmental impact? The reason is that we assess the environmental impacts only within the limits, the national limits of those countries. But if we start assessing the environmental and material impact of those seemingly peaceful and wealthy country, the picture is completely different. Wealthy and seemingly peaceful country are also those that have the highest environmental impacts or the higher responsibility on environmental harm. whilst the countries that are facing conflict or conflict risk are those that are the least responsible to environmental harm. Why is that so? Because wealthy and peaceful countries externalize the environmental harm towards beyond their limit. And their peace rests on that violent system that destroys land, exploit, pollute the resources, but beyond their limits. And if this is the global picture, I would like to bring you to the local one in the next slide. This violent system is also the one that produced the vulnerability to climate, vulnerability to shocks. What happens when communities are expropriated from their land? They don't have access to the resources. They are denied from their political voice or pushed towards unsafe geography. They become vulnerable and therefore susceptible to harm. But armed conflict doesn't act on a vacuum. Armed conflict act on these pre-existing vulnerabilities already created by this violent system. And what happened is, and I would argue that the environmental harms related to wars always act and affect the most those that were already vulnerable before the bombs. If we see in Syria, I can use Syria as an example, but I could use other. The water impact of the war affected those that were in harder to reach area and they suffered pollution and water shortages, but they were already disconnected from the public system before the war. We see here the environmental impact on the border southern area of Lebanon. And those border communities that have suffered phosphorus attacks, they were already living in unsafe geography, in militarized borders and affected by displacement and other form of violence. So in this case, the war reperpetuated the same logic of accumulation that made these community vulnerable before the war started. So in the next slide, I would like to highlight one aspect that the armed conflict accelerates, reshapes this vulnerability. It deepens vulnerability and it makes them sometimes entrenched. And I will use the concept of captivity to describe that situation where communities, the environment itself, cannot escape anymore. It's entrapped into a condition where it can't cope anymore and it doesn't have the resources to do so. That's captivity. I can give you the example of vulnerable communities that are forcibly displaced. When they are displaced, they are not just moved from a place to another. They are moved into unsafe places that are exposed to flooding, places that have no fresh water resources next to them. And if those people are already vulnerable in the first place, they won't be able to tackle and to cope with these difficulties they face, and they become trapped. The other example uses another concept that is called enforced coping. What does it mean? And this, I think our colleague used this concept before. It means that when I am vulnerable and I experience environmental harm, I use short-term coping strategy. They might help me, like using polluted water for drinking, to cultivate, to irrigate, or reducing the food intake, or using illicit economies. This short-lived coping strategy might help us in the short term, but in the longer term, they push into what Ruffat says, named captivity. So an entrapment that I cannot escape. So what I want to say here is that if we don't tackle this pre-existing vulnerability, war on nature become environmental captivity. And in my last message, I want to say that maybe we should ask ourselves other questions. Beyond asking how does nature is impacted by war, we might want to ask, was nature is impacted? Who is affected? Who is able to cope? Who become trapped? And maybe this question will help reshape future recovery agenda in a way that tackle the this violent system that created the war of nature in the first place. Thank you.
Thanks, Elisa. Thanks a lot, Elisa. We come to our last presenter before we open up for questions and discussion. Will, you are at the forefront of climate security policy here in the UK, and you obviously also know the international discussions very well. How do the environmental impacts of war feature in the wider climate peace and security agenda?
Thanks very much. And yeah, great to be on this panel. And yeah, great to hear those really interesting bits of research. I'll try and be quick, so I'm sure there's lots of more interesting conversations and questions to have. But yeah, happy to go into policy frameworks, and then I'll maybe attempt to bring some of that, some of the content we've just had together. Because yeah, I think some really interesting stuff there we can pull out and maybe provoke a few questions in Q&A afterwards. I think maybe I'll just start with, I think the colleagues often ask me kind of, what is this nature, what is this environmental impact of war stuff about? And sometimes I go back to them with very simple examples, like I think someone's used Ukraine a lot, obviously comes up, we know why. Doug obviously talked about it a fair bit. Sudan, obviously another one. Gaza, obviously up there in the Middle East. And on my way here, I was thinking, why is it these three big conflicts always keep coming back as like the key examples of kind of environmental impact of war? I think it's because they are just the most visceral, obvious examples of war, and therefore environmental impacts of war are evident in any situation of war, and those are the ones that just are the most kind of obvious and visceral. And I haven't done the full research of every single conflict in the world, but I would hazard a guess that these environmental impacts of what we're seeing today is kind of everywhere in every single conflict and every single kind of war that we have, fortunately. So just to put that in there in terms of how kind of everywhere this is, and therefore the policy and the kind of frameworks to respond to that, as you won't be surprised, things are a challenge, there's a gap, and there's obviously a lot to go on into this. And I probably should have prefaced this is not FCGO policies, it's my personal view before you kind of take this away. But yeah, I think it's a tricky one to fit into the kind of, say, the policy world. You have IHL, International Humanitarian Law. I'm not going to press to be an international humanitarian lawyer, so I'm not going to go into kind of the detail. But I know, attacks on kind of water situations, water plants, those are kind of civilian infrastructure that shouldn't be attacked in a concept of war. Has been kind of discussions about kind of Rome statutes and things, but I think globally and legally we're probably in a space that's quite far away from A, tweaking international humanitarian law, B, enforcing it in a way that kind of would be in some ways it improves the situation that we have now in terms of current frameworks and kind of legal systems. And then I guess it also falls between a few stools, as Doug was saying earlier. Kind of, we obviously have climate policies, we have nature policies, we have programs. We're talking about kind of integrating silos. I think it's a really, really good point. But it's not an automatic kind of climate policy. We don't talk about this at COPs for various reasons, and we don't talk about it as a kind of climate finance type issue, although I'm not saying it isn't. But then also we don't necessarily talk about it in the defence space. We don't talk about it in the kind of national security space, although that is maybe starting to change. Obviously, the UK published the global environment assessment, which obviously talked about nature security as national security in a kind of more macro, kind of meta global terms. So yeah, it doesn't quite fit. And you know, slightly sketchy ground here, but talking about also ecocide is a term that some countries have. There's a bit of a game you can play. If you look at sort of Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Georgia, these states have a ecocide law, and they all tend to share a certain neighbor to the north. So that could be part of it. And Vietnam as well, so there's a particular history, as we mentioned, with the UXOs. So I guess, yeah, in terms of the response, it's limited, but where the gaps are, I think, as we've discussed here, is integrating some of this climate, nature, and peace building approaches, because as I think a key thread that's run through all the presentations today is this nature as a kind of climate, as a conflict driver, as it presets and it exacerbates all the existing conflict drivers that we have. So if you had an early warning dashboard, which I'm sure some people do, everything would be flashing red. You know, livelihoods being degraded, armed groups, as we're seeing in Chad, sort of popping up. You know, water, Lake Chad Basin, you name, all these kind of classic conflict drivers are being exacerbated and sort of accelerated by these nature risks and the environmental degradation that's driving that. And yeah, the biggest indicator of conflict is conflict. I think this goes back to one of the presentations, maybe the first one, about this kind of said, and slight paraphrasing, but it's the doom loop. It's that nature risks increase conflict, and therefore increases the future risk of conflict, and therefore increases environmental crime, environmental degradation, which then goes back to increased conflict. So I think that's a particular challenge where you can bring your integrated conflict, climate, nature toolkit to, but it's this very steep mountain to climb with the kind of tools that we have available currently, obviously, without kind of really tuning it and finding what we have. And maybe just to leave you on one slightly more positive or maybe naively optimistic thing, which again would be great to get the thoughts and challenge on this, but it also is a great avenue for mediation and peace processes. Whenever you have environmental risks, you also have an opportunity to have a peace process or a different kind of entry point into discussions, whether those are political or governments or even just natural resource agreements. Same with climate change, that it's creating more avenues to discuss peace and mediation and bringing communities together, reduce social tension and social cohesion. Obviously, well, naively, it is clearly a massive risk and an accelerant saying as well, but it's not to say there is also the flip side on the conflict side. I might leave it there because I'm sure there's more interesting people to talk, but yeah, great to hear sort of questions and thoughts.
Thanks a lot, Will. Hey, thanks a lot again for these very insightful comments and presentations. And I think now it's the time for the audience to shine and let us know your questions, your insights, and your comments. If you are in the room, you can just raise your hand to ask a question. If you are online, I think it's post your question in the chat, and Benedetta will take care of them.
I have a question. So my question is kind of more of a research methodology question. So from kind of a research methods point of view, how do we disaggregate conflict-related environmental degradation from things that are quote unquote already happening? So for example, like extraction economies that are already present in Africa, deforestation, dispossessions of land, resource concessions. These all do like very extreme and enormous environmental damage. And these also tend to precede, but also they enable conflict. So how do we disaggregate that as researchers?
And maybe introduce yourself briefly when asking your question.
Very sorry. My name is Sagal Afra. I'm a Somali Canadian researcher. I work part-time as a consultant with anti-tribalism movement.
Maybe we can include a second question right behind you.
Hi, I'm Manon. I am a graduate from SOAS, so it's very pleasure to see Sarah and Jerry. Mine is a more, I don't know, a bit kind of like a critical on age dependency, meaning that, I mean, we know that during a conflict, it's a huge, a massive, violence on communities aspects. So, and then we have as a consequence the environmental part of it. So when international organizations are acting on the ground, I'm afraid is that creating somehow another aid dependency on which community receive, of course, as short-term emergency relief, but to what extent is going to impact us kind of like long-term developmental and of course, like kind of community-led solutions. And and I was also somehow wondering to what extent the environmental side should be integrated inside peace processes, meaning that we already have like the gender parts, like women, peace and security and so on. So like to what extent we can integrate the environmental side and monitor its implementation. So restoration and so on. Thank you.
Okay, cool. I think we give the panel a quick opportunity to respond. Not everyone needs to respond to every question. We want to keep the room open for more audience questions, but maybe we just do a reverse round, starting with Will and then finishing or going on with Elisa, and see whether you want to answer one or both of these questions or respond to them. And you need the microphone, of course. Sorry.
Thanks. I'll leave the methods one to the experts, but no, really good question on dependency. I think it's a really interesting point. And yeah, I think a lot of organizations now, obviously, locally led is more than slogan. Obviously, some people might disagree, but I think there is a genuine need for local understanding, local governance, local direction. Yes, I probably will not be able to get into the answer of dependency, but I think there is that kind of push, particularly in the resilience space, where it's not necessarily this is a climate program, go dig a hole. It's resilience as a toolkit, and whichever those local communities pick from that toolkit around, is it early warning, is it social protection, is it climate, is it nature? That's the kind of the thing that what's that local community need. And then just on your environmental peace building and peace process, it's a really interesting point. And I think there was some stipulations in the Colombia peace process around land and environment and nature there. Obviously, we haven't had too many comprehensive peace process since then for obvious reasons, but I think definitely it will be something that kind of, as it becomes an increasing kind of conflict driver, this will need to be addressed in order to address kind of the root causes of conflict. And maybe I was being a bit flippant earlier about it being an entry point, but it is also a peace. Natural resource agreements are a peace process in and of themselves, and whether you can attach that to a national level comprehensive peace agreement is great, but less likely than a standalone sort of community level peace process. But yeah.
Okay, very difficult question, but thank you. I would start with the methodologies, or maybe, I would start with the methodology first, because I had thought you made me think about attribution science. And you know that there are climate scientists that use a computational method to create a fake war that doesn't have climate impact and compare it with the current war that actually has climate impact, and therefore try to analyze the difference by creating different scenarios. So there are other study are use a case study comparison. There are many methodology that one could use to see the difference between, but I turn the question to you. Do we need to separate? And also I use my presentation to see, do you think that the conflict, the system, the violent system that caused the conflict is that different than the violent system that cause that everyday slow long-term environmental destruction? Okay, we are being critical here, but in a way, we have to counter that violent system. And we don't always have to separate them. And that's the case for climate attribution as well. On that question on criticism on humanitarian aid, I would say that the environment is a victim and has been a victim since a long time. And excluding them from the humanitarian might be harmful from humanitarian policy, etc. But what we should rethink is the humanitarian policy on the first place. So before start adding the environment on that humanitarian policy, maybe let's start rethink the humanitarian policy. Are those policies there to help and to prevent the conflict, or are they just putting patches on to hide something else?
Yeah, I'll attempt the integration in peace processes, and I think you highlighted the Colombia case study, but also I think to think more broadly about this idea of the environmental peace building, where you using natural resources to bring communities together. So if for example, I think I had a brilliant analogy from I'm a woman of a certain age, and names fly off my head quite easily. But there was one of these presentations, a climate security, somebody was doing a TED talk and presented and brought forward the idea of a situation where there was water that, like a river that runs between two countries, and then linking to aid that when the intervention came, that they chose to solve the problem rather than get these two communities who are disagreeing on this resource to come together and therefore bring reconciliation or community cohesion together. I mean, that's far removed from what you're talking about peace processes, but that, starting somewhere from community going up is one of the approaches that you can. On methodology, I wondered, I was thinking more of some ambitious co-creation process that CEOBS and myself and a researcher from Tigray are involved in doing, where we are incorporating OSINT methodology and community, data that has been gathered during conflict to try and come have or present a methodology that we can be able to understand the impact of war on the environment, kind of mapping through to see that damage. And going back to what she said, there is no, you cannot separate the periods in which you're researching. Therefore, it's, I hope I made sense.
Yeah. All right, Doug.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to go for a little adventure through these questions and some of the stuff people have said. Just maybe first coming to some of the stuff that Will was talking about around these gaps in policy spaces, about where do we talk about this stuff. So there was a period from like 2015 to 2022 where the UN's International Law Commission was talking about the legal framework protecting the environment in relation to armed conflicts before, during, after situations of occupation, multiple different types of law. Every couple of years, we would rock up to the UN General Assembly, to the Sixth Committee, and states would give statements about these particular environmental issues in conflict. And it was remarkable for the fact that, around 70 or so governments expressed opinions on these different points of law and its interactions with the environment and conflict. And we'd never heard these positions before. Like, you don't hear this stuff because it's not really talked about at the time. And it was, it was remarkable in that. Similarly, we've worked at the UN Environment Assembly, we've worked on 3 resolutions on conflict there. And it's created a space where states have had to take positions. Some of them have been incredibly poorly informed. It's been a wild ride at times. But overall, we don't have somewhere where states are forced to confront these issues and talk about them and develop policy. You can go looking through the midterm review of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework draft just came out today. There are a number of states there talking about how conflict is interfering with the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. You could look at UNFCCC, and there are a number of states there who are talking about the intersections between climate adaptation and conflict, but it's not in one place, and it's kind of a huge challenge for policy, particularly if you wanted to promote some kind of environment, peace and security agenda. And right now we have a bunch of different components of the environment, peace and security agendas around and in different spaces. UN Security Council might talk about climate. Occasionally a particularly serious environmental issue like the FSO Safa oil tanker might pop up in the UN Security Council, but does the Security Council actually have the solutions to these problems? And then maybe just riffing back a little bit to this question around disaggregation of data, I think it's really challenging. A really good example of this is the work on trying to figure out the climate impact of conflict. So when you start looking at how a conflict has influenced greenhouse gas emissions, it gives you vertigo very quickly when you try and consider all the different variables that are taking place. And this is a completely new area of monitoring. If we think of Iran, we've had some very big fires. Okay, that's fuel which would have been burnt anyway, but more efficiently in engines, potentially. We've had this huge reverberating impact on global economy, reduced consumption, but then we've had some countries shifting to coal who were previously using gas. As soon as you start to try and understand all these different interactions, it gets hugely complicated. So it just behoves you, I guess, to really focus in on what is the question that you want to answer and trying to compartmentalize it like that, but also being aware that often our ways of thinking about this, for example, through an international humanitarian law lens, is stuff that happens at particular clear stages of a conflict, the during conflict. It doesn't talk about the post-conflict. And we have to move beyond these kind of rigid boundaries because we know that conflicts are essentially, there isn't a simple start, a simple finish in most cases. I'll leave it there.
Natalia?
Thank you so much. I will start. First of all, thank you so much for your questions. I think they are very relevant and interesting. And I will start with the latter question about environmental peace building. I'm personally a big fan of environmental peace building, and it's very sad that even though we might have some solutions, we don't have enough opportunities to work on that. We see a challenge of incorporating environmental dimensions into peace building and peacekeeping initiatives. And since I'm representing an environmental organization, I will focus on climate adaptation and resilience, which could be potential areas of intervention in bringing environmental peace building. But I think it's still a quite novel approach, and probably the methods could be refined, how we work together across different disciplines so that we have a common goal and achieve the intended impact. And I would like also to comment on the question regarding disaggregation of data. I think it's a very relevant question, and of course, every time when we worked on environmental impacts of conflicts, we considered that. And of course, there are a lot of limitations. Normally, we use a time frame. So we look at the environment before the conflict and after, and this allows us to observe and assess what were the environmental impacts during the conflict and how they can play out in the future. And we approach this as a limitation because models or even very rich data cannot definitely indicate where one aspect becomes influenced by a conflict, or it has been always like that, or it just reinforced trend. but we, I would say, take it for granted that conflicts exacerbate environmental degradation and climate change. And it is something that that's why these environmental assessments need to be considered, because after the conflict, it gets only worse.
Okay, thanks a lot. I saw some fingers in the room, but we first go online because there are 3 people who waited for a while to ask their questions.
Yes, thanks, Tobias. The first question is from Adam Baker, who asks, what, if anything, can countries do to safeguard and future-proof natural assets to the impacts of conflict, especially those natural assets which people depend on as part of their livelihoods? There is a follow-up question from Luga Akila from South Sudan, who mentioned that in his experience, the conflict actors are creating or contributing to more unexploded ordnance. So Sarah, that's maybe one for you. What experiences do the researchers have on the governments who have little support to the unexploded ordnance exploration and awareness? And how can governments like this be engaged to contribute to support actors supporting removal of exploded ordnances? And then we have a final one from Abubakar Klai, who says that his question is to Natalia on Lake Chad. He mentioned, Natalia, you highlight how the rent extractivism in the lake by the armed group. Can you please further elaborate on the mechanisms used by the armed groups in doing so? Is it done through checkpoints? If so, are there checkpoints in the lake itself, or how does it work?
Okay, given that we have still quite a few fingers and not much time left, I'm exploiting my moderator privileges to say we had one direct question for Sarah and Natalia, and maybe Doug can answer the first one about how countries can protect their environmental assets. Maximum 1 minute per answer. Keep it short so we can have another round of questions. Doug, do you want to start?
That's a very small question. All natural resources. I think it's hugely challenging. I think the first one is to avoid conflict. I think the second one, there are conversations that the ICRC are pushing at the moment around safeguarding areas of ecological importance by trying to designate them pre-conflict. Obviously, huge challenges around that in between, relationships between conflict parties. I think one of the key things in terms of conflict preparedness would be around monitoring and data systems, that if there is an expectation of conflict, looking at how you can ensure that you have the monitoring systems in place domestically using whatever tools to be able to document any risks and document any harm, because that will form the basis of post-conflict recovery, but also around visibility and awareness for any damage which is being caused to that resource base. I'll leave it there.
Wow, impressive. Sarah.
Thank you. I'm not so sure that I caught the question clearly. It's something about whether governments. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so basically the question is about the assumption that conflict actors are creating or contributing to more unexploded ordnance. So basically what he asked is how can governments be engaged to contribute and support the actors that instead support removal and exploration of exploded ordnances?
Not so sure quite. Yeah, I mean the clearance and obligations are guided by the convention, the Ottawa Convention, and therefore, if countries are signatories to these, they have an obligation to clear and to destroy the stockpiles and to support the survivors of these munitions. How can they be supported? There is the whole mechanisms, if they are parties to the treaty, that they get international support through the mechanisms that in place. So I hope that makes sense, because I'm not quite so sure what the question really. Yeah,
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense. Natalia.
Yes, thank you so much for the question. I'll try to answer it. So our report was focused on on the environment of the Lake Chad region, and we didn't go into the details how this system is constructed. I mean, the exploitation system of natural resources is constructed. What we know from field reports and interviews that the main drivers of that system, or what the basis of this system is made or based on criminal activity, and there are a lot of organized criminal groups that use this mechanism and violence basically to impose the system, extraction system, and drive it. So definitely probably power and violence is the basis of these mechanisms. But unfortunately, it was beyond the scope of our report, and we base our judgment on the data that was collected for this particular research.
All right, thanks a lot for the discipline. That gives us time for more questions. I see 4 fingers, which I think if we keep the four questions very brief and the answers brief, we have space for that. So maybe we start here and then go to Beatrice and into the row.
Hi. Hi, my name is Rohit. I'm a PhD student working on prosecution of environmental war crimes. So I wanted to bring in the sort of accountability aspect to it. Talking about environmental sort of monitoring of the harms and the reporting, from your vantage point, do you think that the law and the science are working together in terms of how evidence works at a trial in terms of accountability? Are either of them having a conversation with each other in terms of methodology? And does accountability really matter because there are so many steps before accountability that are yet to be sort of executed? Thank you.
Thank you. Great conversation. Thank you so much for all the presentations. I'm Beatrice Masello. I'm a senior research fellow at Chatham House, working in the Environment and Society program there. It's a question / a comment. I was really struck and inspired by the framing that Elisa put forward in terms of we must tackle this violent economy and system beyond all these dynamics. And that makes a lot of sense. And yet we are not very good at doing that, because especially when it comes to nature, natural resources, environment, we're getting better with climate and definitely with energy after Strait of Hormuz, but we still don't make the linkages to economy, job creation, health, security, trade, all the dimensions, this aspect of integration that also Will was referring to is not there yet. And I think it's very difficult to get there in the current kind of geopolitical context, especially if we look at global processes. I was last week in Dushanbe, the International Water Conference, part of the UN water process, and we were talking about how water processes all these dimensions, and yet in the room there's only water experts. So my question is, how do we, how do we bridge these gaps? Do we need to think maybe more regionally, more locally, get out of these global processes? How do we make the argument and get out of our bubble?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Chorbachi. I work for the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office as well. I'm currently on leave, though, so I'm not affiliated to any particular kind of policy area. I've just finished a posting in Iraq where I worked on our climate, peace building and economic reform program. So this is really an interesting conversation. I was just actually going to pick up on your point and also the point around international community and how they respond to these things. So I agree. I actually think place-based development is having a bit of a resurgence from what I've seen. And I think that is a way that these arguments can be brought together based on a specific area context that might be a useful framing. I've also seen some good examples from some UN agencies in Iraq. So IOM have done some really good work, International Organization on Migration, does some really good work on community-based action plans, getting the community to prioritize what they need reconstruction money to be focused on. Often that's reconstructing water treatment plants, which obviously then has a bit of an environmental element as well. And I know that, for example, the UK government, when we deliver development assistance, we have principles of do no harm for the environment as a minimum. I actually had a question as well on the framing of this conversation. I'm really interested in the fact that most conflict actually, well, a larger proportion of conflict actually includes non-state actors now. We haven't spoken about that as an issue. I don't suggest we get into it loads, but I think it's quite an interesting kind of spanner in the works in this conversation, how you bring non-state actors into the fore through governance and political processes as well to mitigate their environmental harm. But just some food for thought.
On your right.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, this is Ruth Citrin with the Accept program. It was Hannah, right? So all sitting in a row, I think Beatrice, Hannah, and I are roughly revolving around the same sort of question, because I was listening to the multiplier effects there. You know, the environmental impact has a future climate change environmental impact. It has health impacts. It has livelihood impacts. It has future security impacts, and that's just to name a few. So I heard you guys mention, and Doug, I appreciate that point about the monitoring system. And what you guys are, the place-based approaches, and also, thinking about how you come together at different levels. It's not a challenge. I don't know if there's an answer. Does anyone in the room yet have even a micro example of a successful integrated framework, or at least partially successful integrated framework that might start pulling those various impacts and threads together?
All right, these were very insightful questions / comments. The bad news is our time is up. The good news is the conversation is so engaging that I can trust you to maybe stay 4 or 5 minutes longer. So I'm giving my panel a very difficult challenge. That is, pick maybe one question you want to respond to, keep it short, maybe 30 seconds, so we can at least finish the conversation. And maybe we start in the order in which we presented initially, starting with Natalia.
Thank you so much. I will take this liberty and I will address the question about the links to trade and jobs. I think it's a very important question, and the recent report on the Lake Chad just proves that poverty is one of the main drivers of violence, and violence exacerbates the environmental degradation and climate change. And I think one of ways to address these links, especially in the development context, is to incorporate this thinking into the development aid. Recognize that these things are interconnected and have a very concrete intention to address these issues through well-thought measures in a very holistic way. Thank you.
That was perfect, Doug.
I guess on the accountability question, I think it's really interesting that now we're getting this increasing focus on accountability, increasing expectations, ecocide, as mentioned, becoming a thing, even though if it's not a thing as far as the Rome Statute is concerned, but the public expectation is high. And when we first set up our Ukraine database, we were speaking with colleagues who'd worked on the UN Compensation Commission, which is like the example, I guess, that people turn to. And it's like, well, what kind of data should we be collecting? Particularly we're using satellite data and open source stuff from Russian Telegram accounts. And it's like, can this be used for an accountability process? And we're very much making it up as we went along. And 4 years later, it's been really good to see the International Criminal Court publish its report, which I've just put in the chat, looking at how it can integrate the environment more into Rome Statute crimes. And that seems really positive, but there's still a huge capacity gap as far as the ICC are concerned, and really unclear relationships around civil society and how we would potentially contribute to these cases, as well as all the issues around politicization and case selection. I've also put in the chat a blog we ran in 2015 in our predecessor organization around non-state armed groups and protection of the environment. And yeah, it's a huge issue, and it doesn't get a bit of attention because they don't have a seat at the table in intergovernmental spaces. There's interesting questions around people like Al-Shabaab and their famous plastic bag ban and other issues like that, which need to be picked apart more and focused on, and creative ways are needed in terms of engagement. I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks a lot, Doug.
Thank you. I think I was left with a question, or what has stuck in my mind is an example of a case where all the the components come together, and I can't think of any. However, I think there are entry points for these programs. So if you think about humanitarian mine action, which is an area where I know much about, is that there are entry points, for example, for community reconciliations, for livelihood, addressing livelihood. It incorporates, you can think about one context where you bring together humanitarian relief support kind of stuff, development, and also peace building and reconciliation. But also the sector is beginning to embed environmental concerns in their program. So they are maybe a program focus rather than an example of an activity, but also looking at entry points and being context specific, or as a new phrase that I've had, location specific or something like that. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sarah.
Okay, I will try to, I think that some of the questions were very connected, and I will try to give one answer to all the questions. I'll quote Nelson Mandela, who said, if we had the capacity and the power to organize as well as those who make war, we would make peace in one day. And the reason why we cannot reconcile law with science, and the reason why we cannot reconcile and fight all those systems together somehow is also related to this, to our inability to become as powerful and as effective as those who prepare the war. And maybe because it's easier and more convenient to keep the status quo for many of us.
Thanks. Likewise, I'm going to try to hit a couple very quickly. I think maybe on the accountability question, I probably don't have the answer, but I would point you the way of the kind of atrocity prevention movement, or kind of ecosystems, use a terrible word. In the last couple of years, it's moved on a lot, and there's a lot more being done about atrocity crimes, go to the ICC, and accountability and recording. And I think there's a potential that environmental sort of harm could potentially kind of follow that mold, as there's kind of a trend set there, but obviously it's a challenge. The discussion, I think I'd point you the way of the UK's very well published global ecosystems report, so I'm sure you've read, around kind of food security, growth, all the challenges that nature security has to the UK specifically on national security grounds, but obviously through the vector of energy or food security being one of the main ones. So yeah, it's all in there. I think on non-state armed groups, really interesting point. I do quite a lot of work on this. I think I've used the stat 25% of climate vulnerable FCAS are under control of non-state armed groups or de facto authorities. So it's a big challenge. You have this climate finance problem where climate finance goes through the sort of known government, so you don't get climate finance into areas held by armed groups or de facto authorities, which makes it incredibly tricky and just exacerbates the kind of gaps in vulnerability and grievances there. I used to work in Afghanistan, and we talked to the Taliban. They're very keen to talk about climate security, but obviously they wouldn't frame it that way. But there are groups that are interested. They see its legitimacy. They see government plastic bags and in Al-Shabaab, etc. I think it's a very interesting point. And sorry, I'm just going to hit all of them. On the framework, again, definitely don't have all the answers, but I think this is kind of resilience, fragility framework. I was talking about the toolkit earlier. You go to a local community and they pick the tools they need. And I think this fragility movement, about fragility forums and things like that, is a way to kind of see nature integrated amongst all these other areas, but still being locally led and locally chosen, locally decision. Sorry.
No, all right. Thanks a lot, Will. I might add to the question on non-state armed groups having a forthcoming book on rebel environmental governance. That indeed, I mean, a lot of the same mechanisms of environmental destruction we discussed before also apply to conflicts involving non-state armed groups. We also see non-state armed groups often filling environmental governance gaps by the state, however, very often for instrumental purposes, like regulating the cutting of trees because they provide good hideouts, or providing drought relief because it helps to win local support or international legitimacy, rather than out of the goods of their heart and their honest environmental concerns. All right. With that, I would like to conclude this panel with two brief remarks. The first one is I would like again to thank not just the audience for the engaging questions and comments, but also our panelists for all their great insights and presentations. So please join me for a final round of applause.